Forbes as our presenter. She's going to be fantastic tonight. We're so happy that she's joined us and given up some of her evening to talk us through her presentation. We've also got Wayne Reid, who some of you will know, BASW member of staff, and he's just going to talk for a few minutes at the beginning about his role, as it's very relevant to this evening's theme on anti-racist social work and raising the profile of that. Hopefully tonight we'll learn some new things we can take into our practice or whatever our line of work is, and have the opportunity to reflect as well on the themes that are going to be discussed. And I will hand over to Wayne. Maybe a couple more people are coming in. Before I do, we are recording this event, so if anybody wants to speak and is not comfortable with that, you can keep your cameras off. The chat function questions then don't get recorded, so please ask questions in confidence. If you're concerned about any privacy, ask away. Denise Monks is here, who you will most likely know from previous events. She's going to be helping collate the questions, and which we will respond to at the end, and Paulette will respond to those at the end of the presentation, so we won't be responding to them as we go. Don't break up the flow. Okay, so over to Wayne.
Thanks very much, Carolyn, and good evening everyone. Thanks for joining us. I've been asked to say a little bit about my role at BASW, so I'll do that, but I'll try not to take up too much time because I'm sure everybody's looking forward to hearing from Paulette. In terms of the anti-racism work that I'm involved in, so my position at the moment is that I have two part-time roles at BASW, and my substantive role as professional officer, which I've done for about 4 years now. If I could just ask everyone to go on mute, please. I'm just getting a bit of feedback there. Thank you very much. So yeah, my substantive role I've been doing for 4 years at BASW as a professional officer, which is quite a generic role. And then in the last year or so, I have focused also on anti-racism, and I've been doing that officially now for a few months since February, although I did it unofficially just after George Floyd's murder last year. Some of the work streams that I'm involved in are quite diverse and varied. Some of you might be familiar with the book Outlanders, for example, which is a collection of essays, stories and poems. It's an anthology, very much about the hidden narratives of social workers of colour, so particularly proud about that. There's the Black and Ethnic Minority Professional Symposium, or BPS, which is a group that I co-founded at BASW last year, which is made up of 15 social workers from ethnic minority and black communities from across England, all working in different social work environments. It's a safe space for them to be able to offload, but we also have lots of strategical kind of endeavours which we're embarking on, such as events. There's a supervision document that we're looking at, which hopefully we can roll out nationally, and so on. There's a number of presentations and webinars that I've spoken at in relation to anti-racism, which some of you might have seen. If you have, hopefully that's resonated. I'm not going to dwell too much on myself, but there's a variety of anti-racism activities that I've been involved in. So I'm really pleased to be able to welcome and introduce Paulette Forbes this evening, who is a fostering and adoption panel member. Paulette is also a member of the the independent review mechanism panel also, and she's an independent reviewing officer. She also tells me that she wears many other hats, but those are the ones that I'm aware of. So I'm sure that you'll join me in welcoming Paulette, and I shall hand over to you.
Thanks, Wayne, and thank you very much for inviting me to do this presentation this evening. So just a little bit more about me, as Wayne has introduced. My background has been working in safeguarding. I've been a social worker for many years, working in safeguarding initially, and then over the last 10 years I've been working within the fostering and adoption arena. And the training that I have developed has been developed initially, I guess, on the back of the murder of George Floyd last year. But I think the reality is that this has been something that has been close to my heart for a long time. So as Wayne had introduced, I have worked within safeguarding. I'm a vice chair and chair of several fostering and adoption panels, and also just an independent panel member. I provide professional advice and a vice chair role for the independent review mechanism panel, and do independent fostering reviews as well. As I said, this training I developed, it kind of fell on me really in terms of I've been very, very actively involved in protesting following the murder of George Floyd, and really felt that there was a call and a need for this training within social work. And I know some people might have joined today not knowing the background in terms of my background within fostering and adoption. It's mostly relatively generic. I don't claim to be an academic. I don't claim to speak to the other Black and Asian and other minority ethnic views. These are my views. I've got a passion for promoting the Black Lives Matter agenda as a professional, and also in my personal life, as a mum of 3 kids of mixed ethnicity, who it's my duty to kind of make sure that they're prepared to deal with some of the challenges that are out there around race and racism that they're having to deal with on a day-to-day basis. Likewise for me in my world, both professional and also in my personal world. So the training has been delivered to mostly fostering agencies so far. Later on in the year, I'm going to be delivering it to a large regional adoption agency and student support services at Salford University. So it will be tweaked a bit just to kind of meet the audience need, but it's there for panel members, for foster carers, for adopters, for social work professionals, for business support staff, and I hope that people, even if they take something small away from the training that or from tonight's presentation, then I'll have done what I've wanted to do in terms of achieving something. So sorry, what I was just going to say, I had hoped to show some videos this evening, but unfortunately when we were doing the tech check, that's proven to be quite difficult. You will be able to have access to this presentation. At the end, I'll be forwarding a copy of the presentation, and there are links to the videos that I had intended to send. Also, at some point, we're going to be talking and looking at white privilege and the white privilege checklist. And again, I'll make sure that all of that information is forwarded to BASW so that you can have access to that afterwards. There will be some time left at the end for some Q&A, but I am also mindful that I'd like this to be as open a forum as possible, and as the Black professional or the Black presenter that I don't want to be the one necessarily being responsible for giving all of the answers. So there will be some time at the end, but be mindful that a lot of this presentation is about our own responsibility for educating ourselves. So I'm mindful of the time. This is ordinarily a 5-hour training event, and I'm trying to limit it down to an hour. So I will try and rush through as much of it as I can, but I don't want to compromise it either. So initially, I wanted to just highlight this statement that came out from Core and Bath, and this came out fairly recently, which was in February this year. I know that a lot of statements came out on the back of the murder of George Floyd, and some of you may well have read the Huffington Post article, which was written, I think it was back in November. you know, after all of the statements were made about Black Lives Matter and commitment to change. And then in November, there had been some further exploration as to how much change there had been. And maybe unsurprisingly, there wasn't actually a huge amount of change. But this is the statement that came out from Core and BASW, and they were talking about Black children who come into contact with children's services experiencing discrimination and oppression, and that we have to be mindful that there are some groups that are more likely than white children to be subject to a child protection plan and are overrepresented in the care system. Anti-racist social work practice inevitably means that the sector must recognise these failings and actively interrogate and analyse the drivers that lead to such practice, and those of our organisation. So what Core and BASW were saying very clearly, that this is work that can't wait, this is work that has probably waited too long, and we have a responsibility and a duty to ensure that we move forward with ensuring that the Black Lives Matter agenda remains a central focus in terms of our practice. This was a video that I'd hoped to share, and Wayne actually shared this video with me last year. For those of you who haven't seen it, when you get the presentation, do click onto the link. I think the link is in the bibliography and resources section right at the very end. Do click onto that, because I think it's a really grounding poem, and gets people to really think about what it means in terms of everyday lived experience of what it feels like to experience and hear some of the statements about racism, you know, what it feels like in terms of racist comments that are made, microaggressions that we as Black people are having to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So if you get a chance to have a listen to that on YouTube, then please do. The training that I deliver initially talks about, or we start off looking at terminology and the importance of the language that we use. Now, within the world that we work in, and I don't want to offend anyone, because clearly I'm sure you know, the discussions about BAME and what that actually means is something that within our world of social work is very familiar. But as I said, the training is being delivered to other groups in which it isn't quite so familiar. So I apologise if some of the information that I'm sharing, it feels to be at quite a basic level. But clearly the use of the word BAME has come under, there's been a lot of debate about that in terms of its continued use. And we know that obviously it's an acronym that is used to kind of make it easier and neater, tidier and simpler to talk about Black, Brown and minority people. And I guess in terms of the minority ethnic population, we're talking about visible and non-visible minorities here. So, and that's where the debate has come in, and the discomfort in terms of the continued use of the term BAME, because the word BAME just kind of feels like it's very lazy. It's kind of the kind of lazy blending of all kind of groups in terms of minority ethnic people, and it doesn't necessarily reflect the inequalities that are experienced by different groups. So the current debate reflects the discomfort and how people feel that it doesn't necessarily present the true picture of inequality for different groups of people. So one of the statistics that I talk about is the Oxford University admissions figures. So Oxford University, when they talk about their intake, their intake in 2019 looked like it was fairly you know, impressive, relatively speaking, 22% intake BAME students. But when you actually fine-tune that and look at what that actually meant, because BAME could also and would also be referencing students of Chinese heritage, students of Polish heritage, and wider. So when you're looking at those numbers, the 22% takes into account people with white skin as well as people with black and brown skin. However, when you pinpoint it and look at the reality for black students, the actual intake was actually closer to 3.1%. So, you know, it doesn't actually present a true picture of what inequality looks like. This is, again, an interesting terms of reference. I'm not going to read it all because you will have access to this in the presentation. But it's just about our the importance of just maybe thinking about alternative terms that can be used. And this is a terms of reference from an arts and culture group when thinking about different terms that can be used. And so they talk about, you know, we are African diaspora people, we are Middle East and North African people, we are Black British people, we are British Asian, and it's just not being lazy, I guess, in terms of lumping everyone into this one term of BAME, as I said, which kind of feels very, very lazy. And I really like what they say at the end, which, sorry. And they talk about how long it takes to actually consider the language that we use, and the difference between saying BAME and people of South Asian heritage or people who experience racism is approximately 2 seconds, which is nothing. And, you know, is that too much time to devote to taking positive anti-racist action? I don't think so. And I just think that language is a powerful tool, and it's something that we need to be we need to consider and be mindful of, and I think that as a positive anti-racist action, I think we can all afford to give up 2 seconds of our time to consider the language that we use. In the training, we also look at unconscious bias. Again, within the social work setting, this, I'm sure, is part of the maybe the everyday vernacular. You know, we probably talk about unconscious bias, we talk about white privilege, we talk about white supremacy, you know, we talk about, you know, the difference between, you know, why all lives matter, that the whole statement of all lives matter, and why that's been so controversial. But that isn't a discussion point that's taking place in all areas. And I think it's really important to explore with other people, you know, what that actually means, what bias looks like, what bias feels like, what racial bias might look like. So we do an exercise which the circle of trust, which some people may or may not be familiar with, which looks at our own kind of personal networks of people who are closest to us, not family, and recognizing how we tend to align ourselves with people who are most like us, you know, whether that is in terms of race or gender or sexuality or religion or class, excuse me. And so we all have bias, we all recognize that we have bias. It's kind of the lens in which we view the world. But I guess it's having that sense as to how that bit bias might impact on our relationships with other people. So I do ask people to think in terms of a personal reflection about the things that they've heard or read or experienced that might influence their feelings about other people. And for people to kind of think about how that impacts on our interactions with others. the other people that we might come into contact with. So as social workers, you know, the children and young people that we might come into contact with, the birth parents that we might come into contact with, prospective adopters, foster carers, other social workers, and how our biases impact on our interactions with those. We then do a separate exercise kind of looking at what we can do to minimize the impact of our bias, you know, on our interactions with others. So that's something that that people have found kind of quite helpful as an exercise to kind of reflect on. One of the important things for me to look at when I developed this training was about the UK. And when I was involved in protesting last year, for much of last year actually, after George Floyd, one of the things that seemed to come up, and we were subjected, excuse me, to quite a lot of comments and people coming up to us and getting into debates and discussions and arguments, and I think it felt a little bit like people felt that we were jumping on the bandwagon of what had happened in the States, and it's nowhere near as bad here. You know, we don't have the same kind of gun crime, and you know, we don't have the same problems here. For me, the important bit in terms of developing this training was about actually reflecting on and recognizing that we do have significant problems around racism, institutional racism within the UK, and statistics evidence that, and it was really important for me to kind of keep it real in terms of what happens here in the UK, as opposed to necessarily focusing on what has happened and continues to happen in the States. I guess we've seen it all the more fairly recently in the last 48 hours in terms of what has happened after the European finals. And so it comes to the fore again, so we can actually see and feel what's happening here. These are just a couple of statements that were made. I mostly tried, because this is a presentation, as I said, around fostering and adoption and for children and young people who are being cared for. And so I do try where I can to incorporate the voice of the children and the young people, and I do include some videos of children and young people, now adults actually, speaking about their experiences. This is actually taken from a documentary that was on last summer, Racism, My Story. Again, if you've not seen this, I think it's probably still on iPlayer. And these couple of comments I just thought were kind of quite relevant and still continue to be relevant. Some people think that black people are always going on about race. Well, we're not. You don't even know the half of it. You know, it's kind of the tip of the iceberg that people are hearing. And when the news story moves on, which inevitably it will, and it has at different times, you know, things have kind of quietened down, and then something like the football happens, and then it gets becomes more high profile again. But when the news story moves on, attention and prioritization will move on. However, for black and brown skinned people, racism will continue to impact on our lives, and it does. So when I looked at the statistics, I don't want to spend too long looking at the statistics. These statistics are not going to be a surprise, or shouldn't be a surprise. I mean, they're out there and available for us to see. So I considered criminal justice, I considered sport. It was interesting when I was re-looking at the presentation today before starting, I realised actually quite a lot of my references are sport and football related, and I don't know whether that's because I was equally invested in what was going on in the football, but anyway, the information is there. And so, for example, with sport, this is a relatively recent piece of research that had been completed. So they looked at 2,000 statements from 80 games across the Premier League and the Italian, French and Spanish top professional divisions. And they were looking at the football commentary and how players with a darker skin tone were referred to within the football commentary. And it was quite interesting to read that lighter skinned players were more widely praised for their intelligence, for their hard work and for the quality of their play than players with darker skins. And the comments about darker skinned players tended to focus on their physical and athletic attributes. But in terms of all of the statistics that I've looked at, so with the media, for example, you know, again, there's I think it might be one of the next slides that looks at football. And but I could equally looked at the treatment of Meghan Markle, or I could have looked at how the diversity performance on Britain's Got Talent last year was covered within the media. So you know, evidence of racial bias is there. It doesn't take much searching to find it. So this is the news report of the two football players who, again, people might be very, very familiar with this. Excuse me. So on the left-hand side, it is they're both Man City players at the time. I think Tosin Adarabioyo no longer plays for City, but at the time, Tosin bought a house for his parents and spent 2.25 million. And it was interesting in terms of how that was reported in the media, because he was seen as flash and extravagant, and as you can see in that headline, he splashes out on a mansion. You know, how dare he, despite never having started a Premier League match. So that was how, as a young black player, he was represented in the media. And then if you look at the report on the right hand side, I'm sorry, I had to kind of cut and paste bits and pieces from the report, but it's not my own writing, I promise. It is actually taken from the news article. And on the right hand side, we've got Phil Foden. We know that Phil Foden's not really looking much like that now with his blonde, bleached blonde hair, but Phil Foden did exactly the same thing. So he purchased a home for his mum, and he spent 2 million on the home for his mum in Manchester, in Cheshire actually. And he is credited with being, you know, a starlet, and later on in the report it talks about him being incredible. So the evidence is there. You know, we can see the ways in which the colour of your skin is reported on and reflected in a very different way in the media. I also talk a bit more within the presentation or within the training around the impact of being black and the statistics around health and employment and also education. I'm not going to read those out. You can kind of see those. Again, the impact that has been had on the black population around COVID, you know, job interviews and how many job interviews, or even getting past the first hurdle with regards to job applications, black and brown workers need to send before they're shortlisted for an interview. The one area that I am going to briefly touch on is the final one, which looks at education, because that statistic's quite interesting in terms of the ways in which black young boys are viewed by teaching staff, and the likelihood of their being excluded being 3 times higher than their white counterparts. And I've just put an asterisk there actually, because again, people who are on this on here tonight may well be familiar with the Education Select Committee report, which looked at the education experiences of white working class boys, and the fact that they have experienced disadvantage as well. It's quite interesting, whilst that report has focused on class, they've also looked at white privilege, interestingly, because they brought that into the debate and the discussion, and talked about the fact that as a young white working class boy, you probably don't feel that you have actually experienced much in the way of privilege when your educational attainment has been significantly impacted. And they talk about white privilege, and that it's not a helpful discussion to be had. On the contrary, they feel that it's something that shouldn't even be discussed because of a feeling of lack of relevance. My position is that, firstly, any discussion around privilege, and in my training, clearly the focus, and I am unapologetic about that, is around white privilege and race and racism. But I feel that any discussion which looks at privilege, and be that around gender or age or physical ability or sexuality, I think that any discussion that's started should continue around the discussion around white privilege, should open up the door for further discussion around other lack of privilege for other groups. So yeah, no one is saying that by being a white working class boy you are not going to experience disadvantage and difficulties, but the whole subject of discrimination should focus on meeting the needs of the whole group, the whole population. And so whether that is around race or class, that those areas of discrimination should follow in terms of any discussions that we start around white privilege. Sorry, I'm slightly distracted. I've had a young person walking in on me, sorry. Okay, one of the things that I do focus on is looked after children, and thinking about the impact for black children being within the care system. So we know that black children make up about 5% of the under 18 population in England. However, they make up about 8% of the looked after children population. And when you look a bit further down at the numbers of approved adopters and the numbers of approved foster carers, those numbers are very low. So there's only 3% of black British approved adopters in England. And likewise, a large proportion of foster carers, 82% of foster carers are white British. So those statistics again show that there are needs that there are issues that need to be addressed. and we need to consider how those issues can best be addressed. One of the exercises I do, so when we talk about how issues are going to be addressed, a bit later on we talk about some of the key challenges, and we talk about agency considerations, things that we need to consider as social work practitioners in terms of change. But before we move on to that, I ask people to consider this statement, "I can't breathe." And I ask people to think about what image that conjures up for them, what they think of when they see those words or when they hear those words, and who they automatically think of when they see or hear those words. And it probably won't come as much of a surprise that a lot of people talk about George Floyd. Some people talk about the physical sensation about not being able to breathe, being a feeling of being suffocated or asphyxiated. And one of the reasons why I talk about this statement, and again, this is about keeping it focused on what has happened and continues to happen in the UK. One of the reasons why I've included this is because the next slide actually is a list of some of the black men and women who have died in police custody or otherwise following some contact with the police in the UK. So the names that are highlighted in orange are the names of people, men and women, who have died following suffocation or asphyxiation or restraint. Quite often, excuse me, there has been no video cam footage, but clearly if someone has been asphyxiated or suffocated, these words, "I can't breathe," are probably likely to have been said. So the historical context didn't begin last May. The historical context goes back way before then, and continues. So Mohammed Hassan, I have included his name, and I've included his name in red because his was the most recent in which there was a named person. There have been subsequent deaths in which they haven't provided details in terms of race and ethnicity, but that was the 9th of January 2021. It's really quite difficult to get statistics around what has happened to the police as a result of these their involvement in the death of these men and women. Very, very difficult, actually. What I ended up having to do was I ended up having to go back and kind of read the various reports following the deaths. And I just was interested in finding out how many people had been, how many officers had been arrested or had been disciplined or had been convicted, had been imprisoned. And going back and looking at, there are 24 names on this sheet, and going back and looking at those 24 cases, in all but one, the officers were cleared of all charges, and or there was insufficient evidence. There was no officer disciplined. There were no criminal charges. There was no case to be answered. And in some cases, there were up to 15 officers involved in the detention of one person, and the CPS felt there was insufficient evidence to bring any charges. And in only one, and I've highlighted the one case, which is Dalian Atkinson, and I'm really sorry, like I said, I'm continuing to make reference to football, but in this case, Dalian Atkinson died in 2016, and he was a famous footballer, played for Aston Villa, Sheffield Wednesday and Ipswich. And the police officer that was involved received a 8-year jail sentence just last month. And there's another officer who will be involved in a retrial for assault occasioning ABH when Dalian was tasered for 33 seconds, which is 6 times longer than the normal cycle. And this was followed by an assault, and so as an unlawful killing offence. And if I'm correct, because as I said, trying to actually pinpoint the actual statistics, but I think I'm correct in saying that with Dalian Atkinson's most recent case, this is the first time in British criminal justice history that a UK police officer has been found guilty of the manslaughter of a black man. So when we later look at the controversy around the discussion on All Lives Matter or White Lives Matter, I quite often will flick back to this screen because the evidence clearly suggests that all lives don't matter. We also talk about white privilege and what that actually means, what it feels like to have white privilege, what it feels like to not have white privilege. And there's just a couple of quotes there from Layla Saad's book, Me and White Supremacy. And then there's also a statement a little bit later down, which again is a useful guide for parents to share with children in terms of talking about race and racism, and what white privilege looks like. Okay, so white privilege means it's that there are issues and topics that white people often don't have to think about, including, sorry, I've got a box on my screen, including the realities of racism. So talking about white privilege means looking at how our own actions maintain and support racist systems and structures. And that's regardless of intent, because I think sometimes we hide behind, or people hide behind, the fact that it wasn't intentional. And this is about, it's not about intent, you know, it's regardless of intent. For those of you who haven't seen it, there is a white privilege checklist, which I will be sending out with the presentation. And it encourages you to consider, and this might be something to consider in either training or in supervision, white privilege, and there's a list of questions in which you're encouraged to place a check next to, or a tick next to, the privileges that apply to you or that you have encountered. And so if I just read, for example, 5 of those, and you put a check next to, you know, what, you know, whether this is reflective of your experience or not. So I can arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. I can turn on the television or open the front page of the paper and see people of my race widely represented. I can be sure that my children will be given school materials that testify to the existence of their race. I can take a job or enroll in a college. Oh no, let's not read that one, sorry, because it's very American, that one, sorry. I can be late to a meeting without having the lateness reflect on my race. And I can walk into a classroom and know, or into a meeting or into a training event, and I will know that I will not be the only member of my race. That's something that I think for the vast majority of Black people who are attending this evening will feel that unless they're working in an environment which is an environment for Black, Asian and other groups like brown people, that the reality is that it's not unusual to be walking into a room or a meeting and being very much a minority. I also ask people to think about what they can do once they recognise white privilege. And that's about people coming up with answers themselves about, you know, what they can do, what differences they can make. And these are just some of the answers that when I've delivered the training, and I keep adding to it when people come up with other things. So when I delivered the training last week, there was a lot of discussion about guilt and feeling guilty, and then we had a discussion about, well, what do you do with that? You know, what do you do with that guilt? You know, do you sit in that guilt and you know, kind of you just don't know what to do with it. You just kind of you know, at a loss. And you know, one of the things that someone had said was about not taking it personally and not using that feeling of guilt and discomfort as an excuse to disengage or as an excuse not to do anything. Not becoming complacent, recognizing that these issues of race and racism and inequality continue to be very relevant in the lives of people of colour. Learning when to listen. You know, sometimes it's important not to talk. Sometimes it's important to just be quiet and to listen. But then there are other times when it's really important to lift up and raise up the voices of other people. And equally important in all of that is it's really important to speak up, because I can't tell you the number of times that I have been in meetings and, you know, something has been said, people have felt a bit uncomfortable about it, and they're kind of still sitting and waiting to see, is she going to be the one? Am I going to be the one? Am I going to be the one in a fostering panel that raises an issue about, you know, how the foster carer has not addressed the identity needs, the racial identity needs of the child? It's important to speak up, really important to speak up. And the importance of educating yourself and not expecting people of colour to do it. There is so much information out there. It's unbelievable. We have the internet, okay? There is tons of resources and information, podcasts, TED Talks. It's all out there. And we have a responsibility in terms of ensuring that we educate ourselves, you know, and don't necessarily expect others to be responsible for doing that. and use your white privilege to educate other white people, you know. This video at the end, I use very few resources which are not UK based. Again, it's just kind of trying to keep it relevant to here. But this is a really interesting video, cracking the code, and this was one that I was hoping to show. And in the video, a black woman, is in a supermarket with her sister-in-law who's white, and they're both together going through the checkpoint, and her sister-in-law goes through first. She's not from the neighbourhood, and she gets passed through with all of her things that she's purchased, and the black woman, who is local, tries to go through the checkpoint, and is the cashier stops her and checks. She's got a book which has got bad checks in, you know, so people who you need to keep an eye out for because they're not reliable, or they've tried to pay with bad checks before that don't cash through. And she stopped, and she looks through her checkbook, the cashier, just to check whether her check is reliable or not. And clearly, when the black woman says to her, you know, well, wait a minute, why are you doing that? She says, you know, oh, it's just because you're not from round here, and you know, I need to kind of check. And her sister-in-law is the one that kind of steps in and says, hold on a minute, I'm the one that's not from round here. She comes into this shop week in, week out, but you have let me go through without challenging or questioning me. And she steps up and she takes on that mantle, as it were, and you know, pushes for action in terms of recognizing that that is just not okay. So sometimes when you recognize you have white privilege, you have to step up and risk putting yourself out there, risk sometimes maybe being seen as unpopular, to ensure that the voice of others is heard, really. Okay. Sorry, I'm not going to do yet another football reference, but when we do talk about All Lives Matter and White Lives Matter, the image I use is this one, because clearly this is an image that was the banner that was flown across this Etihad Stadium last year. And we look at why that is so controversial. And as I said a little bit earlier, I often go back to the presentation about the statistics in the UK around the death of black and brown men and women at the hands of the police. So clearly, in terms of thinking about White Lives Matter and the historical context around that, I don't think a lot of people were familiar with the fact that All Lives Matter and White Lives Matter, that statement or those statements, were linked to far-right extremism, and were kind of linked to this message of kind of hate and division. So for some people, having that debate and discussion has been kind of quite enlightening for them. And these are just a couple of the statements that I have kind of highlighted for people, for them to get a clearer insight and understanding of why saying All Lives Matter, which for a lot of people, clearly they were feeling that, what we should be saying is that, yeah, all lives do matter, all lives should matter. But what we know is that clearly not all lives do matter, and that some lives are considered as more important than others. So we have quite a lengthy discussion around that, and just recognising the impact of kind of structural racism on the lives of Black people. Because the training is focused on the care lived experiences of Black children and young people, as I said, there are some videos that I use, one of which is Len Sisse, who had been fostered pretty much from birth. He's now in his mid-50s. Excuse me. The intention had been, well, the intention of the local authority had been for him to be adopted. That didn't actually happen. He was actually fostered long term until he was around about 12. I could be slightly off on that, in which he ended up back in care and basically spent the rest of his minor years until he was 18 in various residential establishments. So I do show a video about him talking about his care lived experiences, and I ask people to consider what they think might be some of the key challenges for Black children being cared for by white foster carers and adopters. And I then kind of share with them what children and young people are saying are and have been some of the key challenges. This is actually taken from a piece of research. This is research from the States, and this is back in 2013. However, these views have continued to have been reflected in further research. There isn't a huge amount of research, to be honest, in the UK, but there have been books written. So 2006, In Search of Belonging, talks about the transracial experiences of children placed with adopters. And there are numerous podcasts and videos that you can access when you hear about children who have had care lived experiences, now adults, some young adults talking about their experiences. So some of this information, again, won't come as a big surprise in terms of what young people have said the key challenges have been. So dealing with being different and having a different skin colour, not having people around them that look like them, so limited racial mirrors. And the limited racial mirrors, interestingly, young people were talking not just about living in an environment within a white fostering family or in a white adoptive home, with a white adopter, sorry. But they were also talking about, obviously, their wider community, their schools, but also their access to social work staff that they might have felt more of an affinity to in terms of having people that looked like them, and wanting to consider how they can access support for themselves, and needing very concrete examples of how they might deal with racism and how they might deal with discrimination, and some kind of tools to be able to manage that. We also had heard from children talking about that kind of sense of identity crisis and feeling disconnected or dislocated particularly if there haven't been ongoing discussions around race and being different to their carers.
Carolyn, just 7:30, this is your 10-minute time check.
Thank you.
Thanks.
When we go on to talk about culture and what culture actually is. And again, this is an exercise just kind of thinking about what culture means to each of us as individuals, and thinking about what images and what memories and what thoughts come to our mind. And the reason why I've kind of done this exercise actually is because I was kind of quite interested in reading the assessment reports that are undertaken for foster carers, and the reports when you're assessing adopters, but also the child permanence report, which looks at the needs of children and young people. And quite often there are these kind of quite generic statements that are made within these reports, and there's very little in the reports that kind of evidence and demonstrate cultural competency. So this exercise, in which I ask people to consider culture, again, we just kind of look at what culture what culture feels like. And of course, culture is not static, and it kind of changes over time. But these are some of the things that people have come up with. And one of the reasons why I again highlighted things, so religion, food, skin and hair care, and actually I probably should also highlight language, because quite often in the reports that I'm reading, when people are talking about culture and the culture of children and meeting the cultural needs of children, it seems to be that culture is often reduced to those four things, when culture is so much broader and so much wider than that. And I've highlighted in blue the attitude towards elders, because I quite like to talk about my the way in which culture is broader than skincare. I'm not saying that these things aren't important, of course they're important, but from my experience, in terms of my cultural heritage and my experience. So my ex-husband has known my mum for 30 years, and in terms of referencing her and talking to her from a Black Caribbean background and my cultural heritage and experience, he would be considered as hugely disrespectful to call my mum by her first name. So in terms of attitude towards elders and greetings, my mum has been known as Mrs. Forbes for 30 years. I'm not saying that that is exclusive to my experience and my culture, but the alternative, was that she could have been called mum, or she could have been called auntie. But that is a cultural expectation. And my question when I'm delivering this training is about how are we preparing our children in care to straddle the different worlds that they might need to inhabit, if they are being brought up within an environment that doesn't necessarily reflect their cultural heritage. So what are we doing? How are we preparing them for these, other important kind of, cultural norms and values? What are we doing, and what could we be doing, and what should we be doing? I just talked a little bit earlier about cultural competence, And I thought this was quite an interesting slide, which looks at what we should be looking for when we're undertaking assessment. We are ideally looking for the conscious competent, and if we are assessing someone and they are showing themselves to be an unconscious incompetent, say, or unconscious in terms of their competence, then we need to be considering how we either move people on, or we consider their ongoing suitability or their ability to be able to meet the racial and cultural needs of children and young people. And for me, the evidencing of that is really, really important in the assessments that we're undertaking. I'm just going to skip through just because I'm mindful of the time, and I've got probably about another 5 minutes or so. I'm just going to skip through these next couple of slides. One of the exercises I ask people to do, again, is just thinking about evidencing and demonstrating how our carers are showing their cultural competence. So I ask foster carers, for example, to go into a breakout room and to consider, what questions could you have been asked at panel or in your review to evidence your cultural competence. And likewise for the social work professionals, what questions could you have asked? How are those people that you're assessing demonstrating their commitment to meeting the racial and identity needs of children? I will not go through this because there's a lot of information on here, but these are some of the things that I ask the agency to consider, again in breakout rooms, to think about, your policies and your procedures, to think about your marketing strategy, to think more specifically about the training, to think about the support that's in place, and not just for your carers, but also for children. To think about what assessment tools you have or you could look at developing. And equally, I separate carers for them to kind of think more specifically about their experience, and in terms of their interactions with other people, their homes, and how their homes and their lives might be reflective of their interracial family identity, and who they're meeting up with. Are they kind of accessing and utilising language and translation services to ensure that the voice of the child is heard and that their language skills are preserved and protected? What resources they've got access to, what support groups they've got access to. And I just include this as a tool for agencies to consider using in terms of a cultural competence interview, in terms of demonstrating that through their practice. One of the last slides I'm just going to slip onto, because I think this is quite a good slide, and again, thank you, Wayne. Oh, actually, I think Wayne might have already gone, but this is a slide that Wayne sent to me, again, probably about 6 or 7 months ago, and I apologise because it is a bit blurry. It was the best that I could do, but this is the World Triangle, and it's a kind of considers the holistic needs of all children, but I have looked at this from an anti-racist perspective, And on the left-hand side, it talks about how I can grow. And in the bubbles, it's got various things: being healthy, learning and achieving, learning to be responsible and be confident in who I am. So from an anti-racist perspective, so for example, looking at being healthy and confident in who I am, you know, I ask people to kind of consider the emotional health needs of Black and brown children, recognising the potential impact of mental health, the mental health of children and young people whose racial identity needs haven't been met. I asked them to think about how their children are being prepared to deal with racial discrimination, or other children to be prepared to advocate and step up and amplify and speak up about discrimination, and how they're being supported to develop a positive racial identity. And then things like learning and achieving. I ask people to consider, you know, what your children being taught about their racial and cultural heritage. What are they being taught about their country of birth if they are not from the UK, or the country of birth of their parents, and the country of birth of their grandparents, and the importance of advocacy skills as carers. And on the right hand side, it looks at what I need from people who look after me. And again, in the bubbles, it talks about things like everyday care and help and understanding my family's history and background, and play, encouragement and fun. So again, from an anti-racist perspective, thinking about play, encouragement and fun, looking at who the positive role models that they've got around them in terms of racial mirroring, accessing resources within the community and within the kind of wider community, you know, within your home, that positively reflects your commitment to celebrating your child's racial diversity. And at the end, sorry, just looking at the time, just going to put another 2 or 3 minutes. My wider world, and at the bottom it talks about support from family, friends and other people, school, local resources, a sense of belonging. So again, from an anti-racist perspective, thinking about cultural connections and who you are linking in with, you know, whether that might be the other parents, the birth parents, could be a family member, could be friends, could be connected people, could be siblings, could be the church. Looking at a sense of belonging, again, kind of embracing your wider support network and thinking about the kind of racial makeup of your neighbourhood. So from an anti-racist perspective, kind of keeping the identity needs of the child kind of right in the centre, when you're looking at how you might be able to meet those needs. Yeah, I also include a couple of useful infographics. Again, this is one that has been doing the rounds and a lot of people might already be familiar with it. And the final slide, I just think it's an important one when thinking about allyship and what allyship might look like. So yeah, take on the struggle as your own. This refers to very similarly earlier, transfer the benefits of your privilege to those who lack it. Amplify voices of the oppressed before amplifying your own. Acknowledge that even though you feel pain, the conversation really isn't about you. This conversation isn't. Stand up even when you feel scared. Own your own mistakes and decenter yourself. And understand that your education is up to you. Okay, yeah, then that's just another slide. Sorry, so just in terms of information, as I said, this presentation will be sent to BASW. There is a very extensive resources list in terms of kind of reading and materials that can be used either talking to children and young people, your own reading, but also training courses, which gets updated as new training courses come on, because as you will appreciate, they come on and then they go off. So I know that this most recent Afrocentric parenting skills course is one that's going to be delivered in August. So if people are interested in that, or interested in this for the service users that they're working with, there is a link there, but there is also an Eventbrite link for people to be able to directly book onto that. So if people are interested, then I know that Wayne's got those details, but I equally have those details, so feel free to contact me if you would like more information. Can I just thank everybody, and I thank you, BASW, for allowing me to very, very quickly run through my training presentation, which as I said is normally 5 hours. I'm very dry throated at the moment, but thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Paulette. That was a brilliant, the condensed version of your training. It's really given us an insight into what you cover on your training, and also giving us food for thought around our own work or other activities and structures that we engage with on a daily basis, wherever that might be. Does anybody have any questions? Either pop them in the chat, or you can raise your hand if you want to ask them over the mic.
Have I stunned people into silence?
Hi Paulette, it's Denise. I think it really resonated. The slide you had up, well, all of it did, but I think something that we've been discussing recently, certainly in relation to the family structures, and actually understanding within different cultures what those family structures might be, and that section that you had highlighted around elders, and actually understanding that really resonated, because how we interpret, what from, a white working class or middle class background, what we would expect in relation to care perhaps of our older family members might be very different in relation to how another family from a different cultural background might do that, and expectations and what the norm might be within that culture, which is, so it was really interesting, because that is something that has sparked quite a bit of debate of late. I
think that I guess one of the things that I quite often talk about is just the importance sometimes of just asking. And I think if you're working with children and their families, and you're involved in meetings, just ask. I think sometimes we can be a bit afraid of showing ourselves to be maybe a bit ignorant, but I think it is better to ask rather than necessarily to offend. So ask is what I would is what I would advise.
Paulette, I don't know if yourself or maybe other attendees here have got any examples of any initiatives to address any racism that we come across in our work settings. Kind of a broad question / comment, really, opening up to the discussion. I don't know if you've got any specific standout examples of things that you think have really worked or haven't, on a maybe on a micro level or on a bigger level.
Well, I guess on a micro level, and I talked earlier about microaggression. So, for me as a panel chair, fairly recently, within the last 6 months, I've had someone not being particularly happy about my decision making on a panel, withdrawing a case that I didn't feel the paperwork was appropriate. and being called on the back of that, I think the words were a feisty black woman, and that's within our profession. You know, and I would just say it's just really important to call it out. It's like I said earlier, in terms of, you know, if you see it, if you hear it, if it doesn't sit right with you, you know, kind of you go with your gut and you take responsibility for stepping up and calling it out, and not necessarily, as I said, leaving or expecting other people to do it. I think, you know, as I said, we all need to kind of take responsibility for calling out racism when we see it, when we feel it, when we, you know, yeah, when we see it.
Thank you. Rosie, you've commented in the chat, yeah, following on from Paulette's comments just there, that it can be scary to call it out, but it's so important. And you've also just put that how the overlaps of the family relationship and referencing point is generic across social work, and you've highlighted the role of the AMP in adult and mental health, where we can apply some of that learning as well, that Paulette talked about. Okay. Any other comments? Oh, sorry, Nicola. Sorry. Okay, hi. Any other comments or questions that you either want to ask Paulette or each other? Any comments at all? Your impressive list of resources, Paulette, as well. I really wanted to thank you for including those. I think there's just so much that we're going to get our teeth into.
I mean, you know, to be honest, as I said, you know, the information is out there. You know, I've kind of put it together. There is far more out there, and in terms of, you know, responsibility for finding that, you know, it doesn't take much. It's kind of at the click of a button, isn't it? And for those of you who aren't on Wayne's mailing list, I would highly recommend that you do go on Wayne's mailing list, because, to be honest, probably, I don't know, at least 50% of the material that's in my resources list is probably information that Wayne has sent me in the last 18 months. So if you want to kind of stay on top of what's going on out there, then I would highly recommend that you contact Wayne and ask him to put you on his mailing list.
Great. If anyone doesn't have Wayne's email address, we can pop it into the chat for anybody who wants to be added to his mailing list. There's quite a few thank yous coming into the chat, Paulette. I know you can't see the chat at the moment, but some really really nice thank yous coming in.
Yeah, and I really wish, and I am sorry that we weren't able to get some of the videos up, because I do think that the videos, yeah, bring it to life more. And certainly from the feedback that I've had when the training has been delivered, I think kind of seeing it. So there is the video, the school that tried to end racism, and again, for people who haven't seen that, I would highly recommend you going on to iPlayer and watching that. And if it's not still on iPlayer, I know that it is on YouTube, or there are sections of it on YouTube, and there's a great 4-minute section that I include in the training, which is when the heartbreaking moment when children recognize white privilege. And every time I play that, even though I've played it time and time again, it's kind of quite painful to watch, particularly when you see children at 11 kind of recognizing that kind of discrimination and lack of privilege. So I would highly recommend, for those who haven't seen The School That Tried to End Racism, that you do download and watch that.
Yeah, thanks. definitely. I think Denise is going to post the video links into the chat so people can copy them and save them or
I don't think she is, because I haven't sent them.
No, I haven't sent. Yeah, I haven't received them. Sorry, I was halfway through typing that. I thought it'd be best just to put the mic on. I will put Wayne's email in here now, though, for people.
Great.
All of the video links are in the references section at the end, so you might have to kind of scroll through it a little bit, but all of the video links are in there.
Great. Okay, and I know they'll be circulated after the two attend.
Yeah, I'll get this presentation to Wayne by the end of the week at the latest.
That's lovely. Thanks, Paulette. There's just one final question before we finish, as we're approaching 8, and it's from Jackie. Jackie, do you want to come on the mic, or I can read it out?
Hi, thank you very much, Paulette, and I think you've just reinforced again how complex the whole thing is. But when I worked in Trafford sometime, a long time ago now, thinking almost 20 years, we built quite a lot into the assessment and the review systems to make sure we didn't miss this with our young people. I was just wondering if that is now standard practice, because we actually completely overhauled, well, we put a new dimension in, and I was very fortunate to be working with quite a few of our Black members of staff to do this from various teams.
I wish I could say that it was, but
I mean, I've probably still got all the material, you know, and I could make it, if I could probably try and find it, if this is not happening still.
Well, you know, sadly for me, and I guess which was the motivation for me in terms of delivering this training, is because I haven't seen much in the way of significant change. You know, we are still having children of colour placed with white carers, and very little being done in terms of addressing their identity needs. You know, children who are being raised within a household in which their race and ethnicity isn't even discussed or considered, or, you know, so sadly, I don't really see much in the way of change. However, more positively, actually Trafford is one of the agencies that have asked for some ongoing training around anti-racist practice for fostering and adoption teams. So I think more agencies are kind of coming on board and thinking about what they can be and should be doing differently and doing better.
Yes, I mean, we built in at that time the sort of heritage line into all assessments. We added it, and certainly from my recollection, but I would have to go back, you know, we actually built in more to our whole review process.
My experience has been that when I look at reviews and assessments, that there is a generic kind of statement that's made in the reports, but actually the evidencing of it is weaker.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jackie.
I suppose that comes back to that real person-centered, absolutely understanding what's important to that child and that family, and no tick box is necessarily going to cut that, is it? It's a part of it's developing that culture and practice within individuals to really respect what matters to every individual, but most important, you know, to really understand and seek those questions, seek those answers, you know.
And it's a life's work, you know, like if you are you're providing long-term care permanence to a child of a different race or ethnicity to yourself, you know, it's a lifetime's work. You know, it doesn't just stop at the end of your assessment, you know, once you've kind of been through panel. You know, it's a lifetime's work, you know, lifetime's responsibility in terms of, you know, preparing and promoting and protecting and supporting, you know, it's
and continuing to educate yourself, as you
absolutely.
said. Yeah. You're on mute, Carolyn.
Thanks, Denise. I was saying I'm conscious of the time and it is 8 o'clock. So thank you so much, everybody, for attending this evening and participating. And a massive thank you to you, Paulette, for your presentation and sharing all the work that you've done so far and the information you have with us for us to continue to refer back to and to continue to educate ourselves